Guess what? We just bought a $300,000 house.
When my mother-in-law shared these words, I was utterly speechless. My father-in-law, sitting right next to her, looked just as delighted as she did. Their son John had just passed away, and we had only recently finished the memorial mass. My in-laws, sitting right in front of me, seemed to think only about themselves. And the bank card clutched in my mother-in-law's hands, it unmistakably belonged to my late husband, John. As far as I knew, the balance in that account was. Before my thoughts could go any further, I couldn't help but let out a laugh. Sorry for your loss. The words just slipped out, leaving my in-laws staring at me in utter confusion. Their reaction wasn't what I had expected. They looked unsure about how to respond. It seemed they'd been hoping to see me lose my temper, but from my perspective, I could vividly picture them being the ones losing it. I considered whether I should tell them the truth right away, but decided to hold off and savor the moment instead. My name is Sarah Montgomery, a 42-year-old part-timer. My daily routine involves working at a grocery store in the morning and taking care of the house in the afternoon. I'm married and live with my husband, John, just the two of us. Unfortunately, we weren't blessed with children, but after discussing it together, we decided to focus on enjoying our time as a couple rather than pursuing parenthood. We first met back when I was still working at a company, and John came by as a sales rep. I was working at the front desk, and we'd often see each other whenever he came to talk to one of our employees. Over time, he started inviting me to dinner or the movies, and we gradually grew closer. Eventually, John confessed his feelings to me, and we started our dating. After 3 years of being together, we decided to get married. When it came time to meet each other's families, the visit to my parents went very smoothly. My parents had been eager for me to get married, so the moment John came to introduce himself, they immediately said, "Please marry our daughter." I hadn't expected my parents to react that way either, so I was completely stunned by the sudden turn of events. However, John, keeping a serious expression, and said,
I may be inexperienced, but I humbly ask for your support.
This exchange left me staring in astonishment, my mouth agape, unable to say a word for a while. After that, the atmosphere turned warm and pleasant, and we managed to wrap up the meeting smoothly. Relieved, we headed back home. Next, it was time to meet John's parents, but things didn't go nearly as well. While they did grant us permission to marry without much trouble, the moment I stepped into their home, John's mother, Megan, began sizing me up. She scrutinized my every move, keeping a constant eye on everything I said and did. Under such pressure, I felt I couldn't afford to make a single mistake, which made me so tense that I could barely speak. John did his best to talk and fill the gaps to support me, but even then, Megan kept assessing me, and John's father, Henry, didn't look away either. By the time the visit was over and we were heading home, I was completely exhausted. After we got married, I had hoped we could finally relax and enjoy our time as a couple. However, it seemed my in-laws had no intention of allowing that, as they started visiting our house despite us being newlyweds. My in-laws didn't live nearby, yet every weekend, they would spend a considerable amount of time and money on travel to visit our home. And while John was out for work, they took the liberty of snooping around the house. Since I had quit my job to become a full-time homemaker after getting married, I was always home to receive them. This meant that every weekend, I had to prepare for their visits in advance. The day before, I would spend an entire day cleaning everything from the entryway to the bathroom, the kitchen, and the living room. Any place that might catch their eyes was thoroughly scrubbed. On top of that, I made sure to buy the necessary ingredients to prepare at least one dish, as Megan always insisted on taking home something homemade. To be honest, dealing with Megan alone was more than enough trouble, but Henry would always accompany her. Their stated reason: to check whether I was properly supporting John in his life and work. It seems that Megan's role is to point out my shortcomings as a wife, while Henry's role is to ensure from a husband's perspective that everything is running smoothly. Although Henry rarely asks me to improve anything, Megan is completely relentless. She would give me instructions on things that made me question if they were truly necessary, like specific ways to clean, adding extra seasoning to dishes, or even how to fold the laundry. It was enough to make me feel like I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. As if that weren't enough, my in-laws also feel the need to criticize the fact that John and I don't have children.
Listen, being a wife isn't just about doing housework, you know? It's also your duty to comfort your husband when he comes home tired from work and to work towards ensuring the prosperity of future generations. Neglecting those responsibilities makes you a failure as a wife.
Megan always delivers this speech just before leaving. Even Henry, who's usually standing outside waiting for Megan to step through the door, nods in agreement with her words. It seems they can't leave without throwing some kind of complaint my way. After saying her piece like some sort of parting shot, Megan always slams the front door on her way out. Once the door is shut, I find myself sighing as I listen to their footsteps fade into the distance, a ritual that's become an unfortunate routine. At some point, I protested to my in-laws about this repeated routine, but they didn't listen at all. On the contrary, I was scolded harshly and even told never to bring it up again. Since I was no longer allowed to directly confront them, I felt bad but decided to ask John to step in and address it. John listened to me, apologized with a pale expression, and immediately called his parents to protest. Thanks to his efforts, my in-laws stopped coming to our house from the following week. While I was relieved for a while, I started receiving calls not only on weekends, but also on weekdays. The calls were long and exhausting, leaving me utterly drained. I work part-time at a grocery store in the mornings, so I'm home in the afternoons. Whether Megan knew this or not, she would always call me in the afternoon. The topics of these calls were utterly trivial. She would talk about where she went with her friends the day before, or what she ate. I'd also be subjected to endless complaints about her neighbors, or criticisms of Henry. Occasionally, Henry himself would call, but the content of those calls was often bizarre and borderline inappropriate. Let's just say that some of his remarks could qualify as nuisance calls, and I'll leave it at that. These conversations would drag on, keeping me tied to the phone. As a result, I couldn't go grocery shopping for dinner, and my time for housework was significantly cut short. I could mitigate the risk of running out of ingredients by doing the shopping right after work. However, having limited time to prepare dinner made things extremely difficult. After spending all day and into the evening listening to these relentless calls from my in-laws, I often couldn't finish preparing dinner before John came home. I wanted him to have a warm meal after a long day at work, but keeping up with my in-laws' lengthy chatter made that nearly impossible. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't manage to get everything done on time. John laughs and reassures me that he doesn't mind, while also criticizing his parents' behavior, but Megan, in particular, scolds him for it.
Well, it's only natural for parents to worry about their children. And isn't it because of you, Sarah, that John is saying such things? Hand over the phone right now.
With this kind of escalation, it becomes nearly impossible to stop her. Unlike their previous visit, where they eventually backed off, this time my in-laws were relentless, leaving us both frustrated. At that moment, just as usual, the phone rang, as if perfectly timed for when I had returned home. Of course, it was Megan on the other end of the line.
Let me tell you something, Sarah. Henry is trying to spend his retirement money like there's no tomorrow.
It seemed today's call was starting with complaints about Henry. Feeling exasperated, I let out a quiet sigh, making sure she wouldn't hear me. I sat down on the living room sofa, ready to let her words wash over me. But then Megan said something that caught me completely off guard.
Unlike us, you have it good. John seems to be making a solid profit from stocks. And Sarah, you were smart enough to take out an insurance policy on him. That's impressive.
What? It's true that John is involved in stocks. And yes, he's been making solid profits. But how could Megan possibly know about that? Let alone the life insurance. There's no way we would have mentioned that to his parents. John had started studying and trading stocks because he believed that relying solely on a salary from his job or my part-time earnings might not be sustainable in the future. This year, he finally succeeded in building a stable portfolio. We had agreed to keep this a secret from his parents, along with the life insurance details, to avoid them finding out and trying to take advantage of it. And yet, somehow, they knew. How do you know about that? Without thinking, I blurted out what was on my mind, and Megan responded with a mocking laugh.
Henry found it when we visited your house. Oh, and don't worry, we weren't snooping or anything. He was just checking to see how clean John's room was. So forgive us.
Even over the phone, I could sense her smug, self-satisfied tone, and I couldn't stop myself from snapping back. Even if you're John's parents, do you really think it's okay to do something so intrusive?
Oh my, it's only natural for parents to be concerned about their son, isn't it? And if he has solid assets, Henry and I have been talking about how it ensures our retirement will be secure. He really is such a wonderful son.
Megan spoke with genuine delight, leaving me utterly speechless, my mouth agape. That evening, when John came home from work and I told him about it, he clasped his head in his hands in a textbook gesture of frustration.
I can't believe they found out. That money was supposed to be for us.
John looked deeply troubled, but there wasn't much he could do except curse his parents' nosiness. We spent countless nights discussing how to protect the hard-earned assets from being exploited by his parents. Then, just as we were grappling with this issue, I received a call informing me that John had collapsed at work. That day, I had just come back from grocery shopping and was, as usual, stuck on the phone with Megan, who was taking up my time again. As I silently wished for the call to end quickly, my cell phone suddenly buzzed with an incoming call. Thinking I could finally end the call with Megan, I told her that I'd just received a call on my cell phone.
Oh, who's it from? You shouldn't answer calls from unknown numbers, you know. Anyway, listen to this. Yesterday I was talking to the neighbor.
And just like that, she carried on the conversation as if nothing had happened. I was so taken aback that I lost the chance to end the call. When I glanced at my phone screen again, it had already gone dark. As I continued listening to Megan's chatter, my phone started ringing again. It was the same number, clearly from the same person trying to call me. However, since it was an unknown number, I hesitated, unsure whether I should answer it or not. Seeing it as a chance to interrupt Megan's seemingly endless conversation, I lied, saying it was someone I knew, and forcibly ended the call with her. When I finally answered the ringing phone, it was John's workplace calling to inform me that he had been rushed to the hospital in an emergency. Panicked and pale with shock, I rushed to the hospital, but John had already passed away. The cause was cancer, but it had progressed rapidly, and it seemed he hadn't been making much effort to seek medical treatment. I was told by someone from his company that he had been deeply worried about me being mistreated while he was away and had been eager to come home as soon as possible. Knowing this, I was overcome with profound sorrow as the funeral proceeded solemnly. Even though their son had passed away, my in-laws didn't seem particularly grief-stricken. On the contrary, they seemed restless and distracted the entire time. I couldn't help but notice my in-laws' behavior, but I chose to focus on the funeral instead. After his funeral and the memorial mass had concluded, my in-laws came to visit. Although they hadn't even attended the mass, I reluctantly let them into the house, wondering why they were bothering to come now. As soon as they sat down, my in-laws started talking, and it seemed like they were bragging about something. It infuriated me that they started talking without offering a single prayer for John.
We just bought a $300,000 house.
When Megan shared those words, I was left utterly speechless. Sitting next to her, Henry looked just as delighted as Megan. Their son John had just passed away, and we had only recently finished the memorial mass. The in-laws sitting in front of me seemed to care only about themselves. And the bank card clutched in Megan's hand unmistakably belonged to John. As far as I knew, the amount in that bank book was. Just as my thoughts reached that point, I couldn't help but laugh. Seeing me laugh, my in-laws looked at me in confusion. However, Megan didn't seem to care about my reaction and continued talking.
There was this house I had my eye on for a while. When John passed away, I figured I'd use the insurance money to buy it. On the day of the funeral, I snuck out with his bank card and rushed to buy it just in time.
Sorry for your loss. The words slipped out as I listened to Megan's story, and my in-laws stared at me again, both looking utterly perplexed. Their reaction wasn't what I expected. They seemed unsure of how to respond. It seemed like they were hoping to see me fly into a rage, but from my perspective, I could vividly imagine them being the ones to lose their temper. I considered whether I should reveal the truth to them right away, but I decided to hold off and savor the moment. From what Megan had just shared, I fully understood the situation they were in and had a good idea of what was about to unfold. And while I knew what I needed to do next, a fleeting moment of hesitation crossed my mind. From my perspective, my in-laws were despicable, but for John, no matter what they had done, they were still his parents. For a moment, I thought about letting them off the hook, feeling it might be wrong to hold a grudge completely. But reflecting on everything they had done up until now, I realized I just couldn't bring myself to forgive them. Silently apologizing to John in my heart, I resolved to deliver the punishment they deserved and began my counterattack. I decided to start by pointing out the most obvious issue. Taking the bank card from the house is a crime, you know.
Oh, didn't I just tell you? This bank card was given to us by our son.
That's right. Don't accuse us of stealing. John realized he didn't have much time left, and he gave it to us as a heartfelt gesture.
Henry added, backing her up. Their claims were entirely different from what they'd said earlier, but I chose to let it slide for the moment. However, as I listened to their claims, I realized that if I didn't act quickly, my in-laws would likely start spouting nonsensical arguments to try and steamroll me. So, without wasting any time, I delivered the decisive blow by telling them that the insurance money would not be deposited into that account. Unfortunately, that account is no longer active.
That's impossible.
It's in our son's name. Why wouldn't the money go in?
My in-laws were in a panic, but they didn't seem to understand the fundamental issue at all. It's true that the bank card Megan is holding has John's name written on it. That's precisely why the account is no longer active. Unless I go through the necessary procedures, it will remain completely frozen. When someone passes away, their account is locked, and withdrawing funds requires a lengthy process. And more importantly, I'm the one designated to receive the insurance payout, so there's no way the money would be deposited into John's account. As I calmly explained this to them, my in-laws turned pale. Their cunning schemes, combined with their complete ignorance of how the world works, left me utterly exasperated. And just so you know, the insurance money has already been deposited, so there's absolutely no way it's going to end up in your hands. Delivering the final blow, I stated it clearly, and my in-laws both wore pained expressions. Then Megan glared at me, practically ready to snap, and shouted angrily,
John left behind a substantial inheritance. There's no need for you to be so stingy.
"It's true that I inherited John's entire fortune of $13 million. That had always been the plan, and once his parents found out about the assets and insurance money, John himself had told me as much. Looking back now, I wonder if John already knew the state of his health at that time. The thought made this whole exchange feel deeply saddening.
It's only like $300,000. You could share it with us.
Henry pressed me with those words, but I stood firm, completely unwilling to give in. So, I decided to spell out the obvious once again, making sure they understood. That money rightfully belonged to John, and it's not something I have the authority to give away. Upon hearing that, Megan said something that no mother should ever say.
He's gone now, so you could just give permission in his place, couldn't you?
Hearing those words, I felt my blood boil. Before I could even think about calmly reasoning with such childish logic, I found myself shouting back in a loud voice, "That is not possible." My outburst left my in-laws momentarily frozen, but if they were the type to reconsider their actions, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. Henry snapped back to his senses and tried to talk me into agreeing.
Then how are we supposed to pay for the house?
That's not my concern. Don't you think your actions were completely out of line?
Don't be so cold. We're family.
The word family made my temple twitch in irritation. If they were going to bring up the word family, then what was all their mistreatment of me up until now? It wasn't just during my married life with John. From the moment we visited them to announce our engagement, nothing about their behavior had aligned with the meaning of that word. Even so, I turned a blind eye and went through with the marriage, genuinely believing that one day they would accept me. In reality, far from accepting me, my in-laws treated even their own son, John, with such disregard that it filled me with anger. With that realization, I decided to stop trying to be considerate. No matter how much effort I put into being thoughtful, it clearly wouldn't make a difference to these in-laws. The moment I gave up, it felt as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, making it easier to say what was truly on my mind. Have you acted in a way that deserves to be considered family? I threw those words at my in laws, words that might sound harsh to anyone unfamiliar with the situation. But my in laws, uninterested in listening to anything I had to say, began spouting self centered arguments instead.
We took care of you, didn't we?
Have you ever heard of the phrase unwanted favor?
Well, isn't that disrespectful to your husband's parents?
Megan's mention of disrespect made me instinctively grimace. I had tried to keep my emotions in check, but it seemed I could no longer hold back. You stole his bank card during John's funeral, and you didn't even show up to the memorial mass. Don't lecture me about being disrespectful. I firmly rejected her accusation, but my in-laws showed no sign of backing down. Their relentless greed for John's money infuriated me even more.
We're your in-laws. Taking care of your in-laws is part of being married. You should respect your elders.
And have you ever done anything worthy of being respected? The sharp tone in my response slipped out before I could stop it. To be honest, I don't feel particularly apologetic. In fact, they should consider themselves lucky that I haven't outright blamed them for being the cause of John's collapse. Completely oblivious to my feelings, Megan revealed yet another outrageous fact.
Oh, that's right. Remember when we gave you spending money? Well, that money came from selling things we picked out from your house that you didn't seem to need. But hey, money is money, right?
Hearing that, everything suddenly made sense. It was shortly before John scolded his parents, putting an end to their frequent visits. I once received money from Megan as an allowance. At the time, I thought it was a rare, kind gesture from her, but I never imagined there was such a shady backstory behind it. It's true that afterward, John had been frantically searching for his beloved camera, but I had no idea it had already been sold off. Thinking that the money from selling it was given to me as an allowance was shocking. So that's why John's precious camera went missing.
Well, John was too busy with work to use it, so it was just something he didn't need, right?
Megan replied, giving a seemingly reasonable excuse to justify herself. Unfortunately for her, society would see it differently. That qualifies as theft. When I said that, Megan sighed in exasperation and replied,
You're determined to paint us as criminals, aren't you?
Seeing her shrug her shoulders with that, oh well attitude, I clenched my fist tightly. I was the one who wanted to sigh, and I was the one who was truly exasperated. And yet, their clueless attitude, as if they couldn't understand why, grated on my nerves. Why were my in-laws so skilled at pushing all the wrong buttons? I almost found myself begrudgingly impressed by their talent for infuriating me. You are criminals. However, if I let my emotions explode here, it would only complicate the conversation moving forward. Making an effort to remain calm, I affirmed their statement, but
You can't possibly know that.
do they still think they can talk their way out of this? They're constantly looking for any opportunity to justify their actions. Realizing this was going nowhere, I let out a deep sigh and decided to resort to my final measure. Well then, let's have someone else decide. That way, whether you agree with it or not, it'll be the right judgment, don't you think? My in-laws furrowed their brows, looking at each other in confusion as they exchanged glances. Then, they turned towards me, and with a confused look on their faces, they asked, "What do you mean?"
Who exactly do you expect to make the judgment?
Seeing that my in-laws hadn't noticed anything, I let out an exaggerated sigh. then raised one finger at a time as I presented my options. Would you prefer a lawyer, or would you prefer the police? Upon hearing the options I presented, my in-laws' eyes widened, and they began to panic.
You have no evidence, so there's no way you can prove we did it.
Realizing she was in a tight spot, Megan desperately tried to wriggle her way out of the situation, attempting to find an excuse. However, that wasn't going to work. From the moment my in-laws came to visit, I had been preparing to make sure they wouldn't escape. Do you know what a smartphone is? And by the way, there are these things called recording apps now. Saying that, I discreetly pulled out the smartphone I had secretly hidden in my pocket. Then, I waved it in front of my in-laws, and I could see the color drain from their faces almost instantly.
That's eavesdropping.
Megan screamed at the top of her lungs. But unfortunately, in the real world, this isn't considered eavesdropping. Considering Megan's earlier testimony about the bank card she stole without my knowledge, and the matter of selling John's precious camera without telling anyone. From the moment my in-laws stepped into the house and sat down on the living room sofa, I had already opened the recording app on my phone and was carefully recording everything. Well then, shall we let the police decide about that as well? Even if I were to explain here that this recording isn't eavesdropping, Megan would never back down. In that case, it would be quicker to put them in a situation where they have no choice but to listen from the start. Having made that decision, I started getting ready to leave, but Megan's words, "Don't you feel sorry for your son?" made me stop in my tracks. It's not that I didn't feel sorry for John. In fact, when I decided to take action against my in-laws, I already felt guilty toward him. But even if they tried to force that guilt on me now, my resolve remained unshaken. I'll return that exact same sentiment to you. Instead of backing down, Megan flustered and pressed on.
We were just thinking about you too.
Interrupting her as she started speaking in a condescending tone, I calmly confirmed the situation. So what you're telling me is that, as a result of your thinking about us, after John passed away, you stole the bank card, bought a house, and tried to pay for it with John's life insurance.
Shut up. That's just hindsight.
Whether it was my calm demeanor, my steady tone, or perhaps both, Megan flustered and attempted to argue back. But I didn't allow it and decisively cut her off. No, this is a crime you committed by your own choice. When I looked her straight in the eyes and said this, she finally seemed to brace herself and stood tall. Perhaps she realized there was no way out, and, in desperation, decided to lash out. Either way, it worked to my advantage.
If you're so determined to make us out to be criminals, let's go to the police and have them prove our innocence.
Having made that declaration, Megan, dragging a nervous Henry along with her, tried to leave in a hurry. I didn't stop them, but swiftly finished my preparations and headed to the police station with my in-laws. Once at the station, I explained the situation briefly at the reception. The police officer, sensing the complexity of the matter, separated my in-laws and me into different rooms and began asking us for a more detailed account of what had happened. I explained in detail about our life together since the marriage, including everything that had happened that day, and played back the recorded exchanges as evidence using the recording app. During that time, I could hear loud voices coming from another room, but I didn't let myself be distracted and calmly continued to provide my explanation. As expected, my in-laws were charged with theft and were subjected to more detailed questioning. However, Since they were reluctant to speak, it took a considerable amount of time. During that time, I filed a report and had plenty of time to find and contact a lawyer. I was able to return home that day, but it seems that my in-laws had treated the police officers questioning them terribly, and they were arrested on the spot for obstructing official duties. As a result, my in-laws now have a criminal record. However, I had no intention of letting it end there. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it thoroughly. That was how I felt. With the help of a lawyer, I was able to properly consult and file for damages against my in-laws. I pursued compensation for the emotional distress I had endured, as well as repayment for the money they had gained by selling items from our home without permission. I took every possible step. Thanks to that, my in-laws found themselves scrambling to pay the damages owed to me. Megan had originally been a stay-at-home wife, but Henry had retired and had a retirement fund in his hands. However, that money would now be used to pay the damages owed to me. In addition, they had to pay a penalty for canceling the house they had impulsively purchased. Even after reaching the milestone of their 60s, they found themselves forced to work to pay for the consequences of their actions. It seems that the couple now juggles multiple jobs to make ends meet. Moreover, it seems that the news of what happened spread widely, and they now live quietly in their home, receiving judgmental looks from the neighbors. Well, even if they wanted to move, they're probably too busy scrambling to pay the damages and the penalty fees to even consider it. As for me, using the money I inherited from John, I quietly moved out without informing my in-laws. Until now, we had been living in an apartment, just the two of us, but after John's passing, the loneliness had been overwhelming. So, I decided to buy a new condominium. Though I became a widow, I live a peaceful and comfortable life, praying in front of John's photo every day. Even so, I couldn't completely shake off my sadness, so I decided to make and sell small crafts as a way to pass the time. However, to my surprise, my crafts became quite popular, and now I find myself living busier days than I had anticipated. Through these connections, I've also made some artist friends in the neighborhood. Sometimes, I enjoy having tea with them, gaining inspiration for new pieces, and discussing ideas with them, which has become a source of great joy. Unfortunately, since I wasn't familiar with cameras myself, I wasn't able to buy back the one John had cherished. However, I sometimes look back at the photos John took for me and gaze out at the living room of my slightly too large condominium as I live alone. I often think how happy I would be if I could still be living here with John. I can't help but think about things I can't change, but since I'm smiling in every photo John took of me, I know I need to find a way to live with a smile again. It will still take some time, but I believe time will eventually heal everything. Now that I'm free from the constant worry of my in-laws, I hope to spend the future more peacefully and at my own pace.